Hey guys, welcome to the Balanced Lens, where we talk about faith, culture, and politics from a Christian worldview. I say balance because we're not looking to defend the right nor the left, but lay out the facts and let our audience decide how to interpret those facts. Today, we are talking about a topic that is hot off the press. Everyone has heard, hopefully, about the protests in Iran. A very sad few months where we have many people dying, a lot of uprising. And so, to start off, what's been happening in Iran with these recent protests?
So the current uprising, which is, by the way, not new, they've had protests every 3 to 4 years over the last couple of decades. The current one ignited around 2.5 weeks ago on December 28th, but it has demonstrably shifted from a simple civil unrest to a full-scale national uprising calling for regime change. The main catalyst is that the Iranian rial crashed and it's at a historic low where $1 equals 1.5 million rial, which is just historic. And the scale of the protest it covers all 31 provinces in Iran, and millions of people, especially starting January 8th, responded to a call for national chants, and fear of the IRGC, which is pretty common, has eclipsed by the despair and poverty. So this is like an important turning point in the Iranian people's lifetime. From a response perspective, the regular police and the Basish militia, which is actually a self-conscription, they have reported that they have lost control of some of the areas, and the regime has responded with a brutal crackdown, including nationwide internet blackouts starting around January 9th. They have raided homes for satellite equipment like the Starlink, and there are mass arrests. Estimates suggest over 20,000 detainees. Human rights groups have various reports of death. The Iranian official today came out and said there have been 2,000 deaths, which was surprising to many. But there are some other groups like the Iran International Group, which is an opposition news network in the UK. They cite that that's around 20,000 deaths, which really shows how real the brutality has been. Security forces have even reportedly stormed medical facilities in Elam, Tehran, etc., and they are arresting wounded protesters directly from their beds and beating medical staff who attempt to protect them. So this is a very serious and heartbreaking situation that's unfolding before us in Iran, and it really does seem that the people of Iran are demanding nothing short of change at the highest levels.
This has become an international news story. It's on the major headlines of almost every major country. To reiterate your point, as of today, January 13th, many estimate probably several thousand people killed. Now, that number has actually escalated exponentially throughout the day. I'm hearing now between 10 to 20,000 people. Again, hard to confirm those numbers, but there are many credible news outlets reporting that. What's staggering about that is that the majority of those deaths seem to have happened over the last 2 days. And so some people are saying this might be the greatest single slaughter of people in the country of Iran, maybe the Middle East and, the last few decades. And so the staggering proportion of this is just astronomical and something to watch. But let's take it a step back. Iran didn't just form 10 years ago. This is not a new country, it's an ancient civilization. Could you tell us a little bit about Iran? What's their economy like, their culture, their education? Who are the Iranian people?
I've had the pleasure of having Iranian friends because I was born and raised in Kuwait, and I was there for a long time. Absolutely wonderful people, very resilient, very smart, and quite liberal. Most of the ones I've met, they have very tasty foods that I've had. So that's my personal interaction with Iranians, and I've only had wonderful stories to share. So people are aware the word Iran, it means the land of the Aryans, and it's a historic, prominent Persian nation that has over 2,500 years of imperial history. It has influences from Zoroastrianism, poetry, architecture, and just for edification, it's actually pronounced Iran, and it's officially called Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocratic state that is located in the Middle East. It's got a population of about 90 million people. So remember, we talked about Venezuela, which was about 30. So this is 3 times the size of Venezuela. And Iran ranks 17th globally in both its geographic size and its population size. And it's the 6th largest country in Asia. I would encourage our listeners to go ahead and look at the map of Iran. It's very uniquely located. It's if we were to go around, so it borders Iraq to the west, Turkey, Azerbaijan. These are all in the western part. Then we've got Armenia in the northwest. It's got the Caspian Sea to the north, then Turkmenistan to the northeast, Afghanistan to the east, Pakistan to the southeast, and then it's got the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf to the south. Very unique location where it bridges the gap between the Middle East and the rest of Asia on the east. So, and its unique location explains why this was a very prominent region in the world. And it was a center of culture, agriculture, a lot of richness in this one country. It's home to one of the oldest continuous civilizations. And most of Iran, as we know today, was first united as a nation by the Medes under Cyaxares in the 7th century BC. And then it reached its height in the 6th century BC under Cyrus the Great, which a lot of people have read about even in the Bible. So Cyrus the Great, he's the one who founded the Achaemenid Empire. And so we're talking 6th century BC, right? So it's a very old empire. This is the point. Right now, unfortunately, from a human rights perspective, it's ranked among the world's worst places. I think in 2024, it executed around, just in that 1 year, around over 900 people. From an economy perspective, interestingly, it's got the world's second largest natural gas reserves, only behind Russia, and the third largest oil reserves, behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. So very rich, very naturally rich country, but because of its corruption and other issues, it's got a 48% inflation recently, which is really causing a lot of havoc in people's lives. From a culture perspective, it's a highly sophisticated culture. Literacy rate is very high, over 95%. And this will be surprising to a lot of people that women actually dominate universities. They form about 60% of students. And this creates a massive intellectually secular class of young people. Let me quickly touch on the military. It's an interesting one. It is actually one of the largest standing armies of about 1 million active plus reserves. It's ranked top 10 in terms of global firepower and top 20 in terms of active personnel, which is very interesting if you think about the decades of sanctions that have squeezed this country for them to rank that high. And I've also read in several places, technologically, they're really advanced. I think that in the top 10 in nanotechnology advances, like this is a very rich, literate, sophisticated country. In terms of its military structure, the supreme leader, which is Ali Khamenei, he's the commander-in-chief, and he holds the ultimate authority over all forces. He sets a strategy. It's got a very unique structure. It coup-proofs the regime in a way because it's got two parallel militaries going on. So it's got the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the IRGC. That is the ideological force, and it stands in parallel to the regular army. And the IRGC is tasked with protecting the regime, right? Making sure that its agenda is fulfilled and it is protected from both internal and external forces. It has its own ground, naval, air forces as well. And it also controls the elite Quds force that we have heard of. So it's the equivalent of CIA, you could say. Military intelligence also reports into IRGC. So they control the intelligence as well. It also has what is called this volunteer precision militia, which was really formed during the 1980 war with Iraq for people to conscribe into. It used to be a 20 million strength entity. I don't think it's that much anymore, but it's a volunteer program where people can join and support the regime to make sure that its stance and its policies are implemented. Second parallel is a traditional army. It's called Islamic Republic of Iran Army, or Artesh. It's in charge of controlling the traditional borders of Iran, right? It has the ground forces, so the army, navy, air force, it's all there. But its main goal is maintaining and controlling and protecting the borders of Iran. In addition, under the supreme leader, they've got something called the FRAJA, which is the Law Enforcement Command, and they manage the internal policing and regime stability. And the fourth one is the Armed Forces of General Staff. They are responsible for strategic guidance. Think of it like a joint chiefs of staff. So they've got a sophisticated system, which then will explain to us why it has been so robust in standing up against so many protests over the decades. It's a pretty robust force that should not be taken lightly.
Yeah, excellent overview. And as you mentioned, this is a culture that is refined, it's highly developed over centuries, it's urbane, it's cosmopolitan, but millennia, 550 BC, Persian culture influenced Islamic thought. So I think that's a key takeaway. Iranian culture, Persian culture influenced many aspects of Islam. After, the Muslim conquest of Persia in the 7th century, Persian culture didn't disappear. It became this powerful force shaping Islamic civilization. For example, it shaped government and administration. That was a huge Persian contribution. These early Arab Muslim governance, as they conquered different lands, was relatively tribal and simple. The Persian structure of government, it provided this idea of this large, diverse ruling class. And so it helped really unify a lot of these lands that were taken over by these Islamic conquests. Persian influence was huge in terms of their language and culture in influencing how Islam adopted. While Arabic, remained the primary language of the Quran, um, Persian became the primary language of culture, of poetry, of art, and ethics. And so, across the Islamic world, you see so many Persian writings and Persian poets influencing Islam. Persian thought also influenced, Islamic theology and philosophy. Specifically, many Persian philosophers, they influence ideas of reason and faith and free will and the nature of God. Many of those arguments, interestingly enough, have carried over into Western civilization as well. Persian art also shaped so much of Islamic architecture and their courts and their different styles in terms of their mosque design and calligraphy and painting and music. And so Islam supplied the spiritual foundation of, the Arabic world or the Middle East, but Persian culture, Iranian culture supplied so much of its structure, its intellect, its beauty, its foundational elements of governance. And so it's important to understand that and before we start talking about the nitty-gritty and get into the details of politics. But as a segue into that, we come to the 20th century now. A huge turning point in the 20th century was the Islamic Revolution in 1979. What was Iran before 1979?
It's interesting. I really like the way you were talking about the culture. One thing I did forget to mention, I did mention Cyrus, but what a lot of people don't remember is that there's something called a Cyrus cylinder, which actually provides proof of the first human rights charter in history. And this comes from a Persian emperor. And it's important for people to understand that is the type of country, the type of culture we are talking about when we think Iran. But if we were to zoom in, just for the purpose of our discussion, to right before 1979, when the revolution happened and Khomeini took power. So pre-1979, Iran was under Mohammad Raza Shah Pahlavi, and he was authoritarian. Even though he was modernizing, he was rapidly modernizing the system, but it was an authoritarian regime. The Shah did pursue rapid industrialization and women's rights and aligned closely with the United States. So these were all the positive things from our perspective that happened. And so what happened is by the mid 1970s, Iran actually had one of the fastest growing economies globally. And it was primarily obviously driven by the oil revenues. Iran was culturally open. Women voted, they attended universities, and worked without any mandatory dress codes. It was an open, for all practical purposes, like a Western society. If our listeners go and watch some videos, you'd be stunned at how open that culture was prior to the revolution. Now, it all happened very quickly, right? And that's important to understand that this happened very quickly, 1925. So even in spite of the openness that we saw, there were political freedoms that were sharply limited. There was a secret police called a Savak that reported to the Shah that suppressed any dissent, imprisoned critics, and it censored media. That was this was one of the dualities, one of the ironies of that regime. Even when it modernized, it also suppressed. So you know that anytime you put those kind of ingredients into the pressure cooker, at some point it builds up. In summary, right? Iran before 1979, modern but kind of unequal, very ambitious economically, forward and liberal in its culture, but politically constrained and closed. And these contradiction lays the groundwork into what happens in 1979.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Iran during the 50s and 60s, their economy started to boom due to oil. Before that, very agrarian. And so during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had rapid changes in the country, and that will explain a lot of things that happened during that time, which created a lot of distrust amongst people. So moving to downfall of the Shah, the country completely changes. What were some of the causes of the downfall of the Shah? I mean, country now up to 1979, you would think they're wealthy, they're heading on the right track, oil is booming, their culture is expanding, and you would think the country is on this upward trajectory, but you have this massive revolution in 1979. What were some causes? Why were people so upset?
Yep, there were a confluence of factors. One, there was economic inequality. Even though it was booming economically, you had the elites who benefited from all that wealth, and then there was still inflation hitting the poor, right? Because as wealth sometimes streams in very quickly, prices go up, and not everybody would be able to afford it. There was political repression. We talked about political repression by the Shah because he was like a monarchy, and there was also like some cultural backlash because the westernization happened rapidly. It was so fast in terms of really getting people integrated and mentally absorbed to that type of thinking. So it was seen as eroding Islamic values. And so what happened is Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini at that time was exiled in France. And so he mobilized the opposition through cassette tapes at that time. He unified diverse groups. And this is a very unique group. We're not talking about Islamists at this time, right? There were Islamists, there were communists, there were nationalists. They all came together. And this is what happens when there is a common enemy. There are factions that come together, even though they're not ideologically, they're agreeing to it. They have a common enemy. So they all came together. And then when oil revenues started declining in the late 70s because of the fluctuation of oil prices, inflation rose. Mass protests started and erupted, and it kept escalating through 1978. And the military started fracturing. There were some defections, and at that point, the Shah's fate was sealed, and then he fled the country in January 1979. And then Khomeini comes back and then restarts the government, right? So one of the things to understand, it was not initially Islamists, but they were better organized than other factions. And then once Khomeini returned to establish the Islamic Republic, he was able to consolidate power quickly through purges, and the very memorable hostage crisis at the US Embassy also got everybody united into to fight one common enemy. And so there you go.
Yeah, as you mentioned, right, this wasn't just one single group. There were a lot of different groups involved in the 1979 revolution. Religious conservatives, secular liberals, Marxists, students, merchants, workers, all helped in overthrowing the Shah. There were several reasons. One was authoritarian rule and political repression. Iran, under the Shah, was literally a one-man autocracy. The Shah ruled with very little political opposition. Political parties were dissolved. They were tightly controlled. There was a secret police called the Savak. They became a symbolism of fear. They were known for surveillance and torture and censorship. Intellectuals, students, clerics, activists were targeted. No real meaningful democracy. Elections, though they happened, were seen as rigged. Secondly, rapid westernization and cultural alienation. Shaw pursued aggressive westernization and secularization. They actively promoted a Western lifestyle on Iranian TV. Education, law, life modeled what life was in Europe and the US. So this Islamic Persian identity was being erased. It was seen as a threat. And so religious leaders saw this as anti-Islamic, morally corrupting, disrespectful to Iranian tradition. And so many of these religious leaders, they gained credibility. Number three, with regards to the economy, corruption. There was economic inequality. Oil wealth exploded, benefits were uneven, inflation hurt workers. This rapid development in the economy caused housing shortages, food shortages, urban overcrowding. Furthermore, the Shah was now seen as corrupt and extravagant. There was lavish royal spending that contrasted sharply with the lives of average people. Fourthly, right, Iran was seen as a puppet to the U.S. because the U.S. essentially backed a coup in 1953, removed Iran's elected prime minister, Mossadegh, right? Essentially, he turned the oil industry into a governmental industry, and the CIA came along with Great Britain and they backed this coup. This was not forgotten from the memory of Iranians. And so the US was seen as this power that was essentially not good. And so the Shah had this on his record here. And so many believe the US influenced Iran's military, their intelligence. People felt that the national dignity of the country was compromised. So there was a lot of anti Americanism, right, before 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini, he was able to mobilize people religiously. He framed the Shah as tyrannical, Islamic, corrupt. Mosques became safe spaces for organizing. People shared a common voice. They shared this common emotional bond and ethos in overthrowing the Shah. They encouraged sacrifice and persistence through Ayatollah Khomeini within the religious mosque system. Finally, there was a trigger event, right, that I think tipped things over. In 1978, there was a newspaper article insulting Khomeini that sparked protests. Security forces killed demonstrators, and this really blew up. Funerals became the new protests. This created a lot of strikes in the country and destabilized the country. And so that was a catalyzing event that led to 1979. And so a lot changed in the country. It really turned the country from a secular Islamic country into a much more religiously conservative country that essentially changed its national identity. We talked about protests. What is different between the protests that are happening today compared to the many protests that we've seen in the past? There have been many protests in Iran since 1979, but why is this one different?
Yeah, let's go through a few of the recent ones, right? We don't want to go through all of them, but in 1990, there was a student uprising, and that challenged the fraud that they witnessed at that time. In 2009, there was the Green Movement, contested Ahmadinejad's re-election, and there were millions of people marching at that time. In 2017 to 2018, the protests that were focused on economic hardships that they were experiencing. In 2002, there was the Masa Amini protests against the hijab controversy regarding the moral police, right? And that actually was serious because it led to about 500 deaths. So most of these protests were always met with violent arrests, violence, internet shutdowns at times. This one is a little different in that it's escalated, right? All of these things have been piling up. I think of it like the pressure cooker. Anybody who's used it knows it starts hissing, and there's a point at which the hissing turns into a whistle, a full-blown long whistle. That's kind of how I think about it. It's like at this point, these protests are a culmination of many things. Now there's hyperinflation. People can't afford to buy food, mass unemployment, especially among the youth. I think it's around 30% in the youth faction, which is very high for a very educated liberal society. So the despair, the economic despair and the hyperinflation, and there is weakened proxies. That's actually a big deal this time, which is different from the times before. With the Israeli strikes that happened in 2024, 2025, it severely weakened all of the proxies that Iran had abroad. And now there's been a complete regime change in Syria, so that's gone. Hamas is weakened. Hezbollah is weakened, Houthis are weakened, and there's increased US pressure and rhetoric as well. So one of the things I believe that the protesters are banking on is a strong stance by the United States based on some of the rhetoric that's coming from President Trump. I would also say that the opposition leaders are also more vocal this time from outside, and the number of deaths and the violence is much harsher than before. And anytime there is severe oppression, it's a signal that the regime is faltering. That's why you're now leaning on very harsh ways. The more harsher the regime is, the more stronger the people protest and will never forget it. So
And to reiterate what you said, there are millions of people protesting. This isn't just like Tehran. This is almost every major city in Iran. There are millions of people on the street every night, far larger than any protests that we've seen in the past, likely due to some of those political events like you mentioned. The country has been destabilized, weakened tremendously by what has happened there, which we're going to talk about in a second. But to highlight one of those protests, 2022, 2023, the Mosa Amini protest, I remember that. I remember thinking, wow, this is really interesting what happened here. There was a woman named Masa Amini, 22-year-old. She died following her arrest because she didn't wear her hijab properly. And so she was arrested in jail and she died. And that triggered huge protests in the country. But what we're seeing now is huge, far larger than anything we've ever seen. Now, to understand how to approach this, the US can't just go in there and lay down the law. There's a history between the US and Iran relations from the 70s, even before that, that span multiple decades. Describe that. What are some of the key events between the US and Iran that are shaping our foreign policy today?
it goes back, like you said, a while where we supported the Shah regime. Then once we started seeing that the Shah was abusing human rights and he was having a closed political system, that kind of upset the US. I think it's especially around the Carter regime. He kind of really withdrew support from Shah. And that was also one of the reasons why they ultimately fell. So, and since 1979, I would say it's definitely mutual mistrust. There is some sporadic engagement that happens. And if you were to summarize everything, it would be like a stalemate. That is kind of a summary version of our relationships. The rupture begins in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution and the US hostage crisis, where there were 52 Americans who were held hostage for 444 days. At that point, diplomatic relations were severed. This was around April 1980, and they've never been restored since then. So this is a long time. What is it, like 46 years now? In the 1980s, for those who remember, the US actually backed Iraq. 1979, Khomeini comes to power. The very next year, Saddam invades, and the 8-year Iran-Iraq war unfolds. And during that war, U.S. actually supports Iraq, and we reinforce them with weapons. It just reinforces the Iranian perceptions that America is a hostile nation. And then in the 1990s, we saw more containment through sanctions done by President Clinton at that time. And here and there were some brief openings, but it never really saw fruit. After 9/11, which was one of the turning points in the US, interestingly, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Iran did quietly cooperate with the US against the Taliban. But again, once Iran was labeled as an axis of evil in 2002 by Bush, they again started withdrawing. Then fast forward to 2015 under President Obama, we have the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which was supposed to thaw some of those tensions. And there was supposed to be an exchange of making sure that Iran's nuclear program is meant for civil purposes, there are UN inspectors, etc., in exchange for some sanctions relief. That is all nice until 3 years later in 2018, President Trump comes to power. He tears it apart and then reimposes sweeping sanctions. For President Trump, it was maximum pressure. That was the policy. Relations since then have been oscillating between indirect diplomacy here and there, and then escalations. One of the things that people may not know is that Iran did support us to help with with ISIS as well. So what we see generally is there are some tactical cooperations that happen sporadically, but for the most part, it's not been resolved. It's a stalemate. We haven't reached our goals. Iran has been very resilient. It has one of the top arms program. The number of ballistic missiles are very high, which is why it's in the top 10 global firepower. So it's very interesting how they've still been able to thrive in spite of severe sanctions, not just from the US, but broader EU and the UN.
Yeah, really fascinating, right? This was never a hand-in-hand wonderful friendship even before the Shah in 1953, like you mentioned, right? There was a joint operation between the CIA and MI6 to stage a coup in 1953. Ahmed Mossadegh was overthrown, largely because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. Now, to put this in context, many feared that Iran could fall to Soviet influence in the context of the Cold War, and so this was perceived as a threat to Western interests. Nevertheless, this was not perceived as good by the Iranian people. Another major thing that you mentioned, the U.S. hostage crisis. Great movie on that, by the way, called Argos, I believe. 79, right? 52 hostages were held for over a year. You mentioned the Iran-Iraq war. The U.S. comes in, we support Iraq, right? Not very good for relations with Iran. People don't forget that either, even today. And so that was very important in the history of Iran. Another important thing to think about, 1983, huge event. The U.S. Marine barracks were bombed in Beirut via uh, Iran-linked proxies. Many people don't forget that was a defining moment in the 80s because many people died, many military personnel died. Now, behind the scenes, there was another event called the Iran-Contra, where the U.S. secretly made a deal. They sold Iran arms in exchange for hostages, political prisoners to be released. That money was then taken by the Reagan administration. It was actually sent to illegally fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, defying a congressional ban. There was a whole trial on that. You can read up on Oliver North and what happened there between these backdoor negotiations between U.S. and Iran. But as you mentioned, the 2000s were really shaped by sanctions, economic threats. We talked about the nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran. Eventually, that just faltered, right? Escalated, and then ultimately, the U.S. decided to end that nuclear deal because the conditions of that were not being met by Iran, and so the Trump administration turned its policy towards something called maximum economic pressure. Another important thing to note: 2020, U.S. killed General Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani. To give you an idea of who this guy was, he was the architect of terror in the Middle East. This guy was a very notable general in the Iranian army. He was a well-known figure in the Middle East. And so he was killed in January 2020. That was a major black mark in terms of U.S.-Iran relations. Just last year in 2025, military action against the country. The U.S. attacked Iranian nuclear facilities. This has now evolved from economic sanctions to military strikes in the last 5 years. Key parts of Iran's nuclear infrastructure were destroyed. The Fordow, the Natanz, and the Ifshishan, uh, key nuclear sites destroyed by U.S. military strikes. It was a very symbolic, significant military operation. And so all this took place in the backdrop of significant escalating regional conflict. We come here now in 2026. Iran and the U.S. are not friends here. There's a lot of bad blood here that's brewing for decades. But singling in here on Iran, focusing on Iran and their policies throughout the last few years, how has Iran supported terror? Now, they've supported all these proxies and militias. What are some of those militias? What have they done through them?
Yeah, Iran is designated by the US State Department as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, a designation that's tied primarily to its support of non-state armed groups. Within Gaza, they have Hamas. Within Lebanon, they have Hezbollah. Within Yemen, they have the Houthis. So they are all over the place. Iran provides funding, weapons, training, and intelligence to these organizations. The Shia militias are there in Iraq, as another example, and they used to have more of a presence in Syria, which got overturned. US estimates we have placed Iran's annual support for the regional proxies in hundreds of millions of dollars. With Hezbollah alone, historically, they receive over $700 million per year for getting funding for their military and for their arms and ammunition. So why does Iran do this is a question, right? Strategically, one of the ways Iran thinks about it is that it provides some asymmetric deterrence because they lack the conventional military power to confront Israel or the US directly. So the idea is to extend its influence through proxies, so you can apply pressure at relatively low cost and, worst case, plausible deniability. And ideologically, Iran one thing to remember is Iran actually frames the support that it gives as a resistance against Western and Israeli influence and dominance. Domestically, within its own territory, it reinforces the concept of revolutionary legitimacy. Issue becomes, okay, this is all good, but at what cost? And even for Iran, it's caused regional instability. There's been a lot of civilian casualties. There's been diplomatic isolation, sanctions, which has caused the crisis it's in right now. So again, from Tehran's perspective, this is a defensive strategy, and they consider themselves the axis of resistance alongside their proxies. From Washington's and its allies' perspective, they consider this the Iranian proxy wars that it's conducting as destabilization. The truth is that there is some reality in both of these views, and it's important for our listeners to put themselves in different perspectives to understand why people do what they do, because then it leads us to thinking through better solutions. So again, if you were to think that the US cannot be trusted and they're trying to impose their will, Israel is causing issues within the Arab population, if you were to think that that's all the case from an Islamic Iranian perspective, you can now start to understand why they do what they do outside from pure Western way of thinking.
Yeah, and it's important to realize that over the last 50 years, right, Iran has built this layered network of proxies, right? They've become this epicenter of terror, right, from a Western point of view through Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, the Houthis, Palestinian factions, Syrian allies. All this has been cost effective. It's allowed them to have plausible deniability. It's allowed them to fight multiple battles simultaneously and avoid a direct conventional war. One of the defining moments, as I mentioned, was 1983. The Beirut U.S. Marine barracks bombing was really a defining event in the U.S. eyes as Iran's power over their linked militia activity. That was a huge turning point. And so these proxies have started a lot of regional conflicts. You study the Middle East, you find one of these groups causing problems somewhere. And so this is why Iran has taken such a focal point in U.S. global politics, because it has been the center of a lot of trouble here. But to be fair, we're the balanced perspective. Iran has also done some good in the Middle East to support U.S. interests. For example, post 2001 in Afghanistan, Iran opposed the Taliban and they sought stability after the Taliban fell in 2001. They were helpful in that aspects. Between 2014 and 2017 in the fight against ISIS, especially in Iraq, Iran supported Iraqi forces and they mobilized their militia networks to fight ISIS on the ground. And so that was good for regional stability in the Middle East. And so, we do want to highlight those in terms of what Iran's done to promote regional stability in the Middle East. But fast forward to today, we've seen decades of just problems, decades of US involvement in Iran, decades of Iranian proxy activity through these terror networks. What is the current US policy in Iran? Has it resulted in the actual desired outcome?
So this is the question. How is our public policy working out? Our current policy towards Iran rests on three pillars. It's sanctions, deterrence, limited diplomacy. Now the goal is obviously to curb their nuclear ambitions, which by the way, Iran continuously states that it's for civilian purposes, to reduce Iranian proxy activities, which is the second one, and then to promote human rights, which we know that this regime is going against. The sanctions remain extensive. It targets Iranian oil exports, their banking systems, and all of their key industries. What it's done is it's constrained their revenue, cutting oil exports, for example, from over 2.5 million barrels per day, which was happening in 2017, to now it's well under 1 million barrels. And in spite of all that, it's not really altered the core regime behavior or their thinking. So has it worked? From one side, critics will argue that it just strengthens the hardliners by empowering the Revolutionary Guard and making them convince their population that it's this evil US and the Western allies that's causing all this pain. On the other side, the supporters of the policy will say that, well, this is one of the biggest reasons why Iran has not become a nuclear power, and that's in our best interest. So ultimately, the policies made Iran significantly weak from an economic perspective, but strategically, they have become more defiant.
Excellent a way to say that. And what's interesting, in the early part of the 2000s, 2010 up to 2020, there was an attempt at diplomacy. There was an attempt to come to the table through the Iran nuclear peace talks. Those obviously collapsed. There's been escalating coercion through all these very strict sanctions, not just from the US, but also from Europe and the international community, to now military confrontation in the last 2 years. Just last year, we mentioned the US strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. As of yesterday, there's a 25% tariff on any country that trades with Iran. And so we've even seen in these current protests, President Donald Trump has come out and said that Iran is starting to cross the red line, quote unquote, regarding the protesters. He says there seem to have been people killed that aren't supposed to be killed. We're looking at some very strong options and we'll make a determination. And so the rhetoric now is pointing towards a military confrontation. Just in the last 24 hours, Iran has executed somewhere between 5 to 20,000 people. The president put this out on Truth Social. Iranian patriots keep protesting, take over institutions, say the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a big price. I have canceled all meetings with Iranian officials with the senseless killing of protesters until it stops. And so it seems like all types of diplomacy and negotiations are done, even behind the scenes. So are we headed toward a military confrontation? We don't know. We'll know in the next few days or the next few weeks, but this is certainly escalating way beyond diplomacy and sanctions now. But Iran does have friends. What is their relationship to China and Russia? Because these two countries have been providing them with strategic outs for the last few decades, really.
So, as Iran's ties with the West have deteriorated since 1979, what has it done? It just pivoted eastward to Russia and China. With China, Iran is actually a key energy supplier. They signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement in 2021, which covers oil, infrastructure, and technology. But note, the relationship is just pragmatic. China benefits from discounted oil, which is fantastic for their economic boom, and Iran gains a sanctions workaround. From a Russia perspective, the cooperation's deepened militarily, especially since 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. So Iran has been supplying drones that are used in Ukraine, while Russia offers the diplomatic cover that Iran needs and military coordination. It sends helicopters, warplanes, etc. There is still mistrust among these countries, even though it looks on the outside that it's well. For example, even when things were going really rough last year for Iran between Israel and the US, Russia didn't speak up loud enough, nor did China. And it's really irritated the Iranian regime and some of the officials there. So again, these are all friendships of convenience, so to speak. One of the things that we have to keep in mind, right, again, as we're thinking through policies and what do we do and how do we structure and how do we think of the future, there are always unintended consequences where undesirable alliances form. And the more countries start feeling isolated by the US, by the West, they're likely to start forging tactical partnerships, not even though they're not ideologically agreeing with it. So that's how you had Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, right? So the more the US is isolating certain countries, you see them teaming up. And it's a matter of convenience. They're not necessarily even friends. It's just a matter of being conveniently aligned against a common enemy.
Excellent point. And it's one of the reasons why many people say sanctions don't work as effectively as they could, because countries just run into the arms of Russia and China, and they move their assets there. They seek trade deals with these countries. They deepen their alliances there. And so you cut them off from the West, they go to other places. And so Iran has gained survival, weapons, oil buyers, diplomatic cover. Russia gets regional influence, military assistance. China gets cheap energy. They get geopolitical influence. So these three have a very pragmatic, triangular relationship that support and prop one another up. Important to understand that in the context of any type of action that's going to happen in the next few weeks or any type of diplomacy that will happen. But it's not just Russia and China. Iran has an interesting relationship with other Middle Eastern countries, Iran does see itself as a revolutionary Islamic power. They see themselves as the leader of the axis of resistance against the US, against Israel, against Sunni Arab dominance. And so, how has Iran developed alliances or become enemies with other Gulf countries?
Yeah, these kind of rivalries, right, exist everywhere, and they are echoes of the past tribalisms. Hence, the Iran-Iraq war. But at that point of time, by the way, Iran and Iraq were considered to be significant powers in the Middle East. And right now, if you think about some of the significant powers, it's Saudi Arabia and Iran. Those are the big, sizable powers, right? We still have UAE and Qatar, but they are like geographically and from a the military perspective, they're constrained, but the big powers are Saudi Arabia and Iran. So regionally, right, it actually wields influence in Gaza through Hamas, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, in Yemen through Houthis. But, it's been kind of weakened, obviously, over the last year or so. This influence is also resented by the Middle Eastern countries. Nobody likes people meddling in their affairs. So they don't necessarily have cordial ties with their neighbors. They have somewhat thought a little bit. There was a Saudi-Iran normalization that happened that was brokered by China in 2023, but they're still suspicious of each other, as big nations that are next to each other are expected to be, so to speak. Israel, we all know, views Iran as an existential threat. For good reason, because they explicitly say that Israel should not exist. So there's ongoing shadow wars that are constantly happening between these nations. Turkey competes with Iran. We knew this especially before the current regime took place. Turkey, Russia, and Iran were all in Syria, and they were competing with each other. And Iraq also, by the way. For the most part, what we have seen in the recent Middle Eastern dynamics is the Gulf countries are starting to prioritize economics and economic ties over pure ideology. You see that in UAE, in Qatar, and in Saudi with the new Crown Prince MBS. So Iran is a little out of its element because they're not competing at the same level that the Middle Eastern countries are right now. So from a summary perspective, Iran is actually pretty powerful. It's important to remember it's got a very powerful military, very powerful artillery. It is influential, but currently it is isolated. For the most part, from their neighbors' perspective, they are more feared than trusted, and they are just increasingly reliant on a very few options to bail them out, like Russia and China.
Yeah, it's important for the audience to know, if we don't know much about the Middle East, it's not one big happy family here. There are regional differences, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia and Iran. Probably the biggest source of tension with Iran within the Middle Eastern community after Israel, of course. But, Saudi and Iran, they've had differences over the Houthis in Yemen, big military conflicts there that Iran supported the Houthis in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia had to come in and really clean up that mess. Other democracies or other countries there in the Gulf, like the UAE, Bahrain, have had tension with Iran. And so there are a lot of differences there in their core ideology of how they approach the world and how they approach the Middle East. Some of these countries are also US allies: Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, Israel. These are close allies with the United States. And so we have an interesting mix of diplomacy here between the West and the East in this region. But looking at this current situation now, many in the streets of Iran are chanting for a revolution. Many people want a change in the leadership, in the overarching structure of the Iranian government. I think especially the young people have had enough. But what are some challenges here? I mean, this is not like the game of Risk, right? Where you roll some dice, you pick up a card, and you take over a country. This is millions of people that need to eat. They need electricity. It's a government that needs to be stabilized. What are some obvious challenges here that you don't hear in your nightly talking points from the news?
This is where we have failed in the past because it's not as easy as it looks. It's not as easy as just taking Saddam out or Gaddafi from Libya. Like things just don't fall into place because you take a leader out, because there's a whole system, there's a process. Just like, we all work in corporate companies. You can't just take a few people and expect the process to just run, because it's there is a house of cards. There are things that if you pull, everything else will fall. So some of the key challenges, right, that people need to think through as we are looking at this revolution. The opposition, even though they're loud, they're fragmented. They're all over the place. There's a diversity. What they united is that they don't want this current regime. But that's it. That's the end of that unity. So that's something to think about. One of the biggest challenges is the military loyalty to the regime with these parallel military structures that are very unique. Remember, the IRGC owns ports, they own banks, they own, of course, the bullets, and they are ideologically aligned to the regime. So some of the commentaries that I've heard is unless there is defections that are going to happen in that system, it's really hard for the revolution to succeed. Another challenge to think about is post-revolution, there could be an economic chaos. Like there's all this severe inflation. So this may require mass aid from outside. As always, when something falls, there's a risk of civil war with ethnic factions. There are Kurdish people, there are Baluchis, there are different sects within Iran. It's not just one Iranian people. There's multiple peoples within the same country. So there could be a civil war. Also remember, anytime there is a vacuum, there are other forces that start trying to influence. So there may be countries within the Middle East like Saudi Arabia or a Russia or a China that will try to start filling the vacuum so they can get their interests on board. So these are some of the challenges we need to think about, because transitioning to a democracy normally takes years. And so it's important to have stability in the interim. Remember, the fall of a regime does not guarantee a liberal democracy. History has shown us time and time again that is not a guarantee.
To give you an analogy with an Iranian revolution, if you're remodeling a house, it's easy to take a sledgehammer and start just knocking everything down. That's the easy part. The hard part is actually rebuilding the house. And so the question is, how do you translate these sustained street protests into organized political power that's effective, that can reassert control over this broken governmental system? Although Iran is politically weak, economically weak, militarily weakest than they've ever been because their proxies have been destroyed, their nuclear sites have been destroyed. People want regime change, and the government cannot deliver that in a diplomatic way. So there's a big vacuum here. One of the positives of this was the will of the Iranian people. They're strong. They've been marching despite opposition, despite being killed. Contrast that to like the Afghani people. I'm not throwing shade on people that are Afghani, right? But when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, without a fight, the country fell to the Taliban pretty quickly, right? There was no fight there. And whereas the Iranian people, they are fighting here night after night, year after year on the streets against this regime. But one of the biggest challenges, like you mentioned, Viju, Iran's future depends on the military apparatus. How is the IRGC or the Proxy militia, were they going to defect or remain intact? Are they going to stage a military coup? Are they going to, refuse orders, or are they going to fragment? So there's a huge question here when it comes to their military apparatus and exactly how that's going to function in a post-Iranian revolution, right? And that's one of the biggest X factors. The second big X factor is this: who's actually going to lead the country? There have been many voices from the opposition opposing the Islamic regime here. One of those names is Reza Pahlavi. Who is he? Could he lead Iran?
So Reza Pahlavi is the exiled son of the last Shah. He is 65 years old now, and he lives in the US, and he's been here since 1979. One of the positives of Reza is that he's a symbol from the golden age, so to speak. He's got name recognition, which is really good. That's a plus. He does advocate for a secular democratic referendum, also a plus. Some of the cons are that he lacks any physical organization in Iran, so it's easy to be outside of Iran and talk, just like we are having the podcast. And he's also like viewed with suspicion by many people who remember his dad's private army, the Savak, who used to suppress opposition. So why would they believe his son? So that's some of the things that are going against him. If these protests succeed, he might be able to lead a transitional government as long as there are heavy guarantees that he will indeed strive for a free and fair election to lead to a secular democratic government. But in order to even do that, he needs to get a broad coalition buy-in. You do not want people to have a perception that he's a Western puppet. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, the last thing anyone needs from the son, the eldest son of the previous Shah, is another monarchy, right? That's the last thing people want. But he is influential among segments of the Iranian diaspora. He is somewhat influential within Iran. January 8th, he called for Iranians to chant at 8 p.m. from their homes. There were many people that responded to that call. There were even some of the chants included his name. So he is a symbolic unifying figure for some anti-regime protesters and activists. However, experts, like you mentioned, caution this because while he has visibility among the West and maybe he comes on your local news channel, among parts of the Iranian public, he's still a polarizing figure. So the question remains, can he be the next leader of Iran? Some people think so. For example, Banaf Shahzand, an Iranian-American journalist, editor of Iran So Far Away, says that he's the only viable unifying figure capable of guiding a transition. That question remains up in the air. I guess we'll find out. But there are other names. Another name is a woman by the name of Mariam Rajavi. What organization does Mariam lead?
This lady, Miriam Rajavi, is 72 years old, and she leads an organization. It's called like the People's Mujahideen of Iran, and its umbrella organization, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And she is located in exile in Albania, occasionally traveling to France for certain things. So the positives of the organization is it's highly disciplined, it's organized, it's pretty well funded. This organization, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, was actually once a Marxist Islamist organization. It opposes the regime vehemently right now, and it does advocate for a democratic, secular Iran. So it's made transition in its views, I guess. So that's the organization. Now, the controversy is that this group has faced persistent allegations of having like cult-like behaviors, where it's very rigid and it chooses who marries who within its group. They mistreat their own members. But all of these charges, they deny officially. They actually fought alongside Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war. So a lot of ordinary Iranians even today view them as traitors. So there are some controversies that they have to overcome. They are definitely influential in the opposition. They're more structured. They have to make sure that we have to make sure that whoever leads has buy-in from the people, at least on a transitional basis.
Yeah, what's fascinating about her is that she's actually received political support from senior U.S. political figures, notably over the years, former Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Rudy Giuliani. She does have a 10-point plan for the future of Iran. She has much more structure in place. Her organization, as you mentioned, the NCRI, they have various committees meant to form a provisional government focused on holding free and fair elections to transfer power to the Iranian people. They've had a more militant past. In fact, she has went on air citing that her group is behind some of the protests currently in Iran. But she is a viable figure. Her name has been thrown out there as someone who could possibly help lead an opposition government or a future government. But another interesting name, her name is Narges Mohammadi, Nobel Prize winner, longtime campaigner for women's rights, democratic freedom, abolition of the death penalty. Now she's imprisoned, arrested multiple times, spent more than a decade in prison for charges such as propaganda against the state and acting against national security. In December, she was rearrested by Iranian security forces, but her name has also come up as someone that could be a viable, strong leader for a future Iran. But again, we're talking here on a podcast, right? Imagine you're sitting at the White House now, or you're the Secretary of State. You got to write down an actual plan. You can't just theorize and throw out these wonderful names and ideas and talk about the past. Here's the hard question. What are some practical solutions to support an Iranian revolution or a stable government post-revolution?
The stable government post revolution is what we have been talking about with these different names. The key, no matter who takes on, is to resist the temptation to hold on to power and be very clear that that's a transitional government that's in place and have very heavy involvement from, I'm guessing, the European countries and the US to ensure that they do continue forward with the things that they said they're going to do, just to make sure that you don't get tempted otherwise. But in order to get there, the revolution has to be successful first. And there are some ideas to consider. One of the things that Iran has been doing is creating this digital iron curtain where there's no internet. So some way to have a mass distribution of Starlinks and VPNs to break this digital curtain. Iran has supposedly been jamming these Starlinks. I don't know how to make sure that that doesn't happen, but that's one thing that I'm sure President Trump is talking to Elon Musk and others. You can continue to apply diplomatic pressure, like withdrawing ambassadors from Tehran, human rights monitors, more targeted sanctions, especially on all of the regime elites, not just within official capacity, but even unofficial capacity who are supporting the regime. You could have some economic incentives and protections for defectors. You'd covert support obviously is always there to help with the intervention. It's interesting to see if we can support these bazaars, these merchants who have been like the economic pillars, like the people who make sure that goods and services are flowing. Is there something that we can do to kind of support them, to help them walk off, to stay away from their jobs while they continue without starving, while they continue with the revolution? So anything along that we can help support the revolution while being careful that whatever we do is not seen negatively by the public, because that'll just mean that you're going to have a lot of negative resentments right after the revolution, which will then be counter to everything that we're going to try to accomplish over there.
Yeah, definitely a tough question. Like, how do you actually implement a practical solution here? And those are excellent ideas and certainly things that would help influence a more stable transition here. I think there should be a couple goals, and I think you touched on a lot of these. Number one, we need to get rid of the current regime. The Iranian people don't want them. I'm pretty sure most of the Gulf countries don't want them. The US doesn't want them. Secondly, we need a stable transition from chaos to order. Third, we need free and fair democratic elections. Finally, fourth, we need military backing for a new government, maybe new military backing for a new government. So I'll start with the solutions that won't work. Ideally, the UN should be there, but the UN won't work. Anything the UN does doesn't work. I know we're fair and balanced, but the UN is a farce. They're a laughingstock. It's a good time to remind the audience that Iran, which likely just killed between 5 and 20,000 people in the last 2 days, which has systematically violated human rights for the last few decades, currently sits on the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. I guarantee you that if you took my son's first grade friends and put them in a room, they could do a better job than the UN, because the UN does absolutely nothing. I think if you went to a zoo and put a green button in the middle of like a bunch of gorillas and they had a chance to hit the green button, that will be doing more than the UN. So the UN, I think, is completely useless when it comes to implementing structure and really creating peace in the world. This should be their job, and they're not doing that. Sadly, secondly, I think another solution that won't work. Sadly, diplomacy, I think it's failed for the last decade. I think we're at the end of diplomacy right now. I don't think that's going to work. Thirdly, a full US intervention with US troops, also not going to work. We're looking at another Afghanistan, another Iraq. Could they help topple the current regime? Yeah. Could US troops on the ground ensure a stable transition? Yeah. Could they guarantee free and fair democratic elections? Probably. Could they help provide the military backing and training for a new government? Probably. But Americans don't want another 10 or 20-year war. Americans don't want to spend trillions of dollars in Iran. The Iranian people don't want that. And so these are solutions that won't work. But, if I was in the White House, if I could have an ear with Marco Rubio and tell him what to do, just brainstorming here, I think number one, You need an alliance of nations, especially the Gulf states. You need many of our Gulf allies, led by Saudi Arabia. You need Bahrain, you need Jordan, you need UAE. You need to have an alliance with these countries and really formulate a plan for what to do with Iran because we need their support as neighbors to have stability in the region as opposed to having thousands of US troops in the area. I think these are the nations that should help ensure that there's a stable transition. These are the nations that should help ensure that the people of Iran have a representative government. And so, number one, my solution is, an alliance with these nations led by the US. Number two, limited US intervention. I say limited because we need to destabilize the IRGC. We may need to destabilize these radicalized elements within the Iranian government, but we need to do it without troops on the ground, without any type of prolonged war here. But I think the US has to do something. Thirdly, I think we need a pathway to expanding refugee settlement from Iran to other countries. You look at Iran and you think, well, what do we do to fix it? I don't think we need to fix a broken machine. I don't think America has to be involved in every single country in the world doing something. Now, if they're in the Western Hemisphere, I think that's much different. But this is a country in another part of the world. Though they're important to geopolitical issues, though they're the cause of many of the world's problems, I don't think it's the job of America to fix every single issue. And so we do have a heart for the Iranian people. How can we work with countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE and Bahrain and Qatar to provide legal pathways for refugee settlement or anyone who wants to leave Iran? And so we need to enable policies that are safe, voluntary, that can really aid in an orderly movement of people that don't want to be there. As much as we want to help the Iranian people, I think we need to realize that the Iranian people have a will. Sometimes you just have to leave. It's your decision to stay in a country or leave. I think we need to facilitate that option for people. Fourthly, we need to expand smart sanctions against specific individuals, specific institutions responsible for repression. People such as the commanders or the generals in the IRGC, Basji commanders, judges, prison officials, state media executives, anyone that's supporting the current regime, I think needs to have targeted sanctions on them. Alongside that, fifthly, systematic seizure of their assets, any regime-linked assets to destabilize these corrupt leaders that are, imprisoning and killing Iranians. Finally, maybe one of the most important things to ensure freedom and information access. And we talked about Starlink, we've talked about anti-censorship VPNs. I think that's the infrastructure for any type of change is going to be the free flow of information. And so, if I ever get a chance to advise a president, this would be my points here, but definitely not the UN. But to close off, you're listening to this, you're a Christian, you're a believer, you're thinking, why does a country on the other side of the world matter to me? This is not affecting my morning commute. I'm not going to be thinking about Iran during the weekend. I care more about the NFL playoffs. To a Christian in America, why does an Iranian revolution or, for that effect, anything going on in Iran matter to a believer in the US?
One of the stats I was able to find, the official Iranian census, it's from 2016, states that there are around 118,000 Christians. However, by various reports, we have heard that Iran's underground church is one of the fastest growing in the world. And there is an estimated 1 to 3 million Christians, despite the severe persecution that they face. Onwards, for example, face imprisonment, and house churches are raided routinely. So, a revolution could bring an end to this torture. It could end blasphemy laws. It could allow for open worship. It could foster religious freedom. Before 1979, Christians had more liberties. And so, a new regime with a more secular mindset could revive that. I say could revive that, and it's intentional. Because from what I've observed, the purest version of Christianity has always thrived in face of persecution. So will it grow at the same range if you remove persecution? I don't know. But regardless, because we strive to make sure that fellow Christians are able to worship in peace and live in peace, I would want a more secular Iran so that that faction of the population can thrive and grow and live in peace.
Excellent point. And to be balanced, right? I'll say this. Since 1979 Islamic Revolution, Christians in Iran, right, they have not enjoyed full religious freedom, but there is limited constitutional recognition. Iran's constitution does officially recognize Christianity alongside Judaism and Zoroastrianism, as minority religions. And so this allows historic Christian communities like Armenians and Syrian Christians to worship publicly to maintain churches. But what's not allowed is Iranian conversion to Christianity. There's severe restrictions on evangelism, on house churches, distributing Christian literature in Persian, or even meeting privately for worship, right, can be seen as acting against national interests. And so converts to Christianity frequently accused of apostasy or subversion. And so many of these people are often thrown in jail. By God's grace, Christianity has not disappeared from Iran. The house churches in Iran are growing. Christianity is still vibrant in Iran, though covert, though underground. And so, we do have a responsibility there, not just to the Christians, right, to the Muslims as well. But, we have a responsibility there to ensure that people are not being killed because of their faith, and that more than anything, the gospel of Jesus Christ can go freely without any type of restriction. And so, for anyone listening that doesn't live in Iran, this is important, regardless of whether they're Christian or not, right? There are people being killed here, not just in the last week, but for decades. So this should be a country and a situation that we should all pray about and definitely think about. And so, any final thoughts?
I would say as long as we allow the people of Iran to decide their future in a free and fair way, that country will be fine. It is so dynamic and so historically rich. I just think, in my personal opinion, it has got the potential to become one of the fastest thriving countries in the world. It's got all the ingredients. It's got the intellectual prowess. It's got the military might. It's got the population. It's got the landscape. It's got every ingredient you need to be one of the most thriving countries, democracies, hopefully, in the entire world. If you just allow the people the freedom to choose their leaders and to live up to their potential in every space. It's one of those countries that they're lucky to have every ingredient already there. All they need is a system that will help them thrive and grow. And so one of the things I would recommend our listeners to do is just do a Google search of Iran. Just read through their Wikipedia. Click on some of the photos. Just look at the landscape. Just look at the people. Just look at the architecture. You'd be amazed by what a beautiful country this is.
Excellent analysis, and more so a reason for all of us to keep this story on our radar. It's not going away. This is a story that is really developing by the hour as of today, January 2026. And so continue to pray for this country, pray for um, the US, the government in the US, and how they approach this. Pray for the Iranian people, especially, and their boldness on the streets, the fact that many are being imprisoned and being killed. Another reason that we should not take liberty for granted here. Again, thank you all for joining The Balanced Lens. We hope you enjoy our podcast. Encourage you to like and subscribe, and we'll see you for the next episode. Thanks, everyone.